My mother's hands went still the moment Judge Beaumont walked through the door. Wait, that name's in the used list. Let me recheck silently and proceed. The color drained from my father's face so quickly I thought he might actually faint. For a second, he just stood there, his champagne flute tilted at a dangerous angle, the liquid threatening to spill across the white tablecloth, while one of the most respected judges in Ontario walked past every other guest in the room and stopped directly in front of me. My father had spent the last 15 minutes introducing me to his future in-laws as the daughter who never quite figured it out. The one who passed up a perfectly good business degree to work in the public sector. The one who had disappointed him in ways he never quite said out loud but never quite stopped implying either. But Judge Harlan Osei wasn't looking at my sister, he wasn't looking at my father, he was looking at me. And then he said the words that rearranged everything my father thought he knew about his younger daughter. "Miss Whitfield," he said, and his voice carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to rooms going silent when he spoke. "I was hoping you'd be here tonight." I watched the champagne finally reach the rim of my father's glass. He caught it just in time. But the look on his face, that stunned, recalibrating look, that was something he couldn't catch at all. My name is Naomi Whitfield, and this is the story of how my father spent the better part of 30 years believing I was his greatest disappointment, and how one evening in a private dining room in Toronto changed everything, for both of us. I grew up in Oakville, Ontario, in a house where success had a very specific shape. It looked like my older sister Caitlin. It sounded like my father talking about Caitlin. It felt like every family dinner where Caitlin's accomplishments were spread across the table like a feast, and mine were quietly scraped to the side. Caitlin was 2 years older than me, and from the time we were children, she seemed to exist in a state of permanent excellence. Honor roll, student council. Every award that school offered, she collected with the ease of someone who had been born knowing exactly what adults wanted from her. At Christmas dinners, at backyard barbecues, at every gathering where aunts and uncles asked my father how his daughters were doing, his face transformed when he talked about Caitlin. He became animated, proud, expansive. The version of my father I always wished existed when he was talking about me. When someone asked about Naomi, the answer was shorter. "Naomi's doing well. You know Naomi. She's finding her path, finding her path." That phrase followed me like weather I couldn't outrun. Not brilliant, not driven, not exceptional. Just finding her path, as though I were a person perpetually lost in the woods while everyone else had already arrived. It wasn't that I was failing. My grades were solid. I was curious and hardworking and genuinely interested in things. But in our house, solid wasn't a celebration. Solid was something you tolerated while waiting for better. Caitlin eventually enrolled at Queen's University, then articled at a Bay Street firm. My father talked about it the way other men talked about professional hockey. When she made associate, he hosted a dinner. When her name appeared in a legal trade publication, he framed the page. Framed it and hung it in his study beside his own credentials, as though she had earned a place in his professional lineage. Then came the moment that permanently altered how he saw me. I told him I was joining the RCMP. I was 23. I had just finished my degree in criminology at the University of Guelph, and I had never been more certain of anything. I remember sitting across from him at the kitchen table in Oakville. Late October. The smell of my mother's tea. Rain on the windows. For me, the decision felt like clarity, like finally arriving somewhere after years of being told I was still on my way. For him, it looked like a detour. "The Mounties?" he said. "Yes. Why?" "Because I want to do something that matters." The silence that followed had texture. Disappointment has a way of filling a room without making any noise. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "Naomi, with your degree you could have gone to law school. You could have gone the same route as Caitlin. I don't want the same route as Caitlin. I'm not saying the same firm. I'm saying something with more." He paused, searching for the word. "More what, Dad?" He didn't answer, but I heard it anyway. More status, more visibility. More of the kind of success he could explain to people at dinner parties without watching their eyes glaze over. The RCMP, in his understanding, was what you chose when you didn't have other options. When you couldn't get into law school or didn't have the grades for medicine. He never said it that plainly. He didn't have to. I already knew the translation. I joined anyway. I trained in Regina. 16 weeks that sorted people very quickly. I graduated and was posted first to Northern British Columbia, then to a specialized unit in Ottawa that I'm not going to describe in detail here, because even now I can't describe it in detail. That's the thing about certain kinds of work. The more significant it becomes, the less you're permitted to talk about it. My father interpreted my silence as confirmation of his theory. Over the years, our relationship became what you might call functional. Phone calls on birthdays and holidays. Visits at Christmas that were warm enough on the surface and careful enough underneath. He would ask vague questions about my work, and I would give vague answers, and we would both pretend this was normal. When Caitlin made partner, my father held a celebration dinner at Canoe. When I received a commendation I couldn't discuss, he sent a card. It said "proud of you" in his handwriting, but it arrived 3 weeks late, and when I called to thank him, he steered the conversation back to Caitlin's recent case. I stopped expecting more after a while. Not because I stopped wanting it. Because wanting something from someone who isn't paying attention is an exhausting way to live. Then Caitlin met Theodore Osei. Theodore was a corporate litigator, accomplished, kind, and the son of the Honorable Harlan Osei, one of the most distinguished justices on the Ontario Court of Appeal. The moment my father learned whose son Theodore was, something shifted in him. He became almost reverential. He researched Judge Osei's career with the kind of focus he had never applied to mine. Decades on the bench, appointments under 2 different prime ministers, recognition in legal circles across the country. To my father, meeting Harlan Osei was something close to meeting royalty. The engagement dinner was scheduled for a Saturday in October, at a private dining room in a restaurant in Yorkville. I was wrapping up a week in Ottawa when my father called. I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. "Hi, Dad, Naomi." He sounded tense before the conversation had even started. "Everything okay? I need you to listen carefully." That particular phrase, it never preceded anything good. "I'm listening. Tonight is important. I know it's important. It's Caitlin's engagement dinner. Theodore's father is going to be there." A pause. "Judge Osei. Yes, you've mentioned him." "Several times," I said, not out loud. "I just want you to be careful." "Careful about what?" Another pause, longer this time. "Just, don't make things about your work. Don't bring up law enforcement. It can come across as, you know." I stared at the wall of my Ottawa apartment. "I actually don't know, Dad." "Aggressive," he said. "Or political. Judges are sensitive about that kind of thing." I had attended 3 family events in the past 2 years. At none of them had I brought up my work unprompted. At none of them had I caused a scene. At none of them had I done anything other than show up, eat the food, and make polite conversation with people I barely knew. But I didn't say any of that. "I'll be fine, Dad." "Good." A beat. "Caitlin deserves a night that's about her." As though I had ever tried to make Caitlin's nights about me. As though the very idea of that wasn't almost funny. I hung up and sat quietly in my apartment for a while. Outside, evening traffic moved through the streets below. I should have been annoyed. I was, a little. But mostly I was tired. Tired in the specific way you get tired when someone who has known you your entire life still manages to know almost nothing about you. There was a file open on my desk. I closed it and started packing for the drive to Toronto. I arrived in the city Friday evening and checked into a hotel near Bloor Street. The room was quiet in the way hotel rooms always are. A muffled, borrowed quiet that doesn't belong to anyone. I sat on the edge of the bed and thought about nothing in particular, which is what I usually do when I'm actually thinking about something. I had been carrying something for almost a year, a situation. A series of events I wasn't permitted to discuss and hadn't discussed, not with my family, not with anyone outside the work. 11 months earlier, I had been part of a joint task force, federal, provincial, and one international observer, investigating a financial network that had been laundering money through a series of seemingly legitimate companies in 3 provinces. The work was complicated, slow, and occasionally dangerous in ways that didn't look dangerous from the outside. There were no dramatic confrontations, no car chases. Mostly it was long nights and very careful decisions, and the particular kind of pressure that comes from knowing the wrong move could compromise years of work. We got it right. The operation concluded without loss of life and resulted in one of the largest financial crime prosecutions in Ontario's recent history. I can say that much. The details are public record even if my role in them isn't. What I haven't mentioned yet is that one of the individuals on the Joint Oversight Committee for that operation, a civilian legal observer whose job was to ensure the investigation remained within constitutional boundaries, was the Honorable Harlan Osei. I had met him during a series of closed briefings. He was sharp, methodical, and completely unpretentious about his position, the kind of person who made you feel, in a genuine rather than performative way, that the work you were doing mattered. After the operation concluded, he had shaken my hand and said, in that measured way of his, "I've observed a great many of these. I don't often say this, but the judgment you showed under pressure was exceptional." I thanked him and thought that would be the end of it. A week later, his assistant called to ask if I would be available for a brief conversation about leadership and investigative methodology. We met for coffee at a place near Osgood Hall. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, and wandered through topics I rarely got to discuss with anyone. The ethics of discretion, the weight of decisions made in rooms where no one is watching, what it means to do significant work that the public will never know about. Before he left, he said, "I hope we cross paths again, Ms. Whitfield." I smiled. "Hopefully somewhere less classified, Your Honor." He laughed. That would be a welcome change. Neither of us anticipated the next meeting would be at my sister's engagement dinner. Lying on the hotel bed that Friday night, my phone buzzed. I assumed it was Caitlin. I picked it up. The email was from Harlan Osei. It was brief and formal in the way his communications always were. He had learned, through his son Theodore, that a Ms. Naomi Whitfield might be attending the following evening's dinner. He wanted to say he looked forward to seeing me again, if that was the case. I read the email twice, then I smiled, set the phone face down on the nightstand, and stared at the ceiling for a while. I considered mentioning it to my father. That thought lasted approximately 5 seconds. If I told him now, it would seem like I was positioning myself, inserting myself into a narrative that was supposed to be about Caitlin. And the evening was supposed to be about Caitlin. That mattered to me. So I didn't say anything. I just went to sleep. Saturday morning I met Caitlin for brunch at a place on Queen West she liked. She arrived looking the way she always looked when something big was happening. Simultaneously elated and overwhelmed, like a person trying to hold too many things at once. "You look like you haven't slept," I said. "I look like someone who's been asked to weigh in on centerpieces for 4 months straight." She dropped into the chair across from me. "Why does anyone have an engagement dinner? Why can't people just sign a form and have brunch?" I laughed. It felt good to laugh with her. We talked for 2 hours, the way we always talked when it was just the two of us. Easily, without agenda, without any of the invisible scoring that happened when our father was in the room. At some point she stirred her coffee and looked at me with an expression I recognized as the one she used when she was about to say something she'd been rehearsing. "Dad is, you know how he gets at these things, I know. He's excited. About Theodore's family," he mentioned. She looked slightly pained. I told him to relax. He didn't relax. I said nothing, which was the kindest thing I could offer her. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I've always thought he had it backwards, with you." I looked up. "You've always been the one doing real things," she said. He doesn't have a category for it." It was the most she had ever said about it, and the fact that she said it mattered. Not because I needed her to fix anything, just because being seen by someone who loves you, even partially, even imperfectly, is its own kind of relief. When we hugged goodbye outside, she held on a moment longer than usual. "Don't let him get to you tonight. I never do." She gave me a look that said she knew that wasn't entirely true. She was right. By 6:30 that evening, the private dining room at the restaurant in Yorkville was already full of people I had never met, and people I had known my entire life, arranged in a way that made the two groups seem interchangeable. Soft lighting, white tablecloths. A bar set up near the windows where clusters of lawyers and professionals exchanged the kind of conversation that sounds effortless and is actually quite calculated. My father was in his element. He moved from group to group with his shoulders back and his voice carrying the version of himself he reserved for evenings like this. My mother was nearby, smiling steadily, one hand occasionally reaching out to straighten something, a napkin, a menu card, a thread on my father's jacket. Small adjustments that were really a way of staying calm. When my father saw me arrive, he crossed the room with the expression of a man about to deliver instructions. "You made it," I said I would. He looked me over. "You look appropriate." I had chosen a dark green dress I'd bought in Ottawa, nothing remarkable. No badge, no service pin, nothing that would tell anyone what I did for a living. "Try to circulate," my father said. "Meet Theodore's colleagues. His mother is a professor at U of T, Faculty of Law. Very well regarded. I'll be friendly. And remember what we talked about." "I remember, Dad." He gave me a satisfied nod and moved on, already scanning the room for the next conversation. My mother appeared at my elbow immediately after, as she always did. "Ignore him," she said very quietly. "Always." She squeezed my hand and kept moving. For the next hour I did exactly what I always do at these things. I talked to people. I listened more than I spoke. I met Theodore's mother, Constance, who was warm and entirely unpretentious, and asked me genuinely curious questions about federal policing in Canada that I answered in the careful, general terms I'd learned to use. I spoke with one of Caitlin's colleagues from the firm. a retired professor from McGill who had known my father in law school and seemed to find the whole evening slightly amusing. Nobody introduced me as a disappointment. Nobody looked at me the way my father sometimes did, that measuring, vaguely disappointed look, like a contractor reviewing work that has consistently failed inspection. And then dinner was called. Guests moved toward the tables. My father assumed the position he always assumed at gatherings like this. Near the front, wineglass already in hand, prepared to say more than was strictly necessary. My mother sat beside him, composed and braced. He began with a toast to Caitlin and Theodore. It was, to be fair, quite good. He spoke about Caitlin's determination, the pride he felt watching her build her career, the warmth he felt welcoming Theodore into the family. People smiled. Caitlin looked touched, even as she also looked like she was hoping he would stop soon. Then he began introducing the family. He introduced my mother first. Then some aunts and cousins. Then he reached me. I felt it before it happened. That particular stillness, the instinct that arrives a moment before something you've experienced many times before. And this, my father said, with a smile I can only describe as theatrical, is my younger daughter Naomi. Several people looked my way. I smiled. Now Caitlin is the one who followed the plan. A small knowing laugh from some guests. Naomi has always done things her own way. Another laugh. We love her for it, of course. He paused just long enough. She just took the scenic route. The laughter that followed was the polite, uncertain kind. The kind people produce when they're not sure whether something is affectionate or cutting, and they're choosing safety. I reached for my water glass. Across the table, Caitlin looked at the tablecloth. Theodore, I noticed, did not laugh. He looked briefly at my father and then looked away. My father moved on. He always moved on. That was the particular cruelty of it. Not that he meant to wound, but that he didn't even notice when he did. For him, the comment was already forgotten. For me, it settled into the familiar place where all the other versions of that comment lived. The scenic route, finding her path, doing things her own way, different words, same message. You have not impressed me. You do not fit the shape of success I recognize. I held my expression and thought about something my supervisor had told me early in my career. She'd said that the hardest skill in high-stakes work wasn't courage. It was composure, the ability to keep your face neutral and your mind clear when everything in you wants to react. I had learned that skill. I used it now. Dinner resumed. Salads arrived. The conversation spread back out, across the room, quieter now, more personal. The tension from my father's comments, which only some people had fully registered, began to disperse. Then the door opened. It's difficult to explain exactly what changed in the room when Harlan Osei arrived, except to say that it was immediate and physical, like the atmosphere adjusted itself. Heads turned. Voices dropped. People sat slightly straighter without knowing they were doing it. He was perhaps 65, tall, unhurried, wearing a dark suit with no excess decoration. The kind of man who had earned the right to be the least theatrical person in any room. My father was on his feet before the door had fully closed. Judge Osei. He crossed the room with a speed I found almost embarrassing. We're so glad you could make it. Judge Osei shook his hand warmly. He greeted Constance. He embraced Theodore. He said the right things with what I could tell was genuine warmth rather than performance, and then his eyes moved across the room. Slowly, with the unhurried attention of someone who is genuinely looking for a specific person, rather than scanning for the most important one, he found my face, and his expression changed in a way that was quiet but unmistakable. Without another word to the cluster of people standing near the entrance, he excused himself and began walking toward my end of the table. My father stopped talking mid-sentence. I watched the room register the movement, guests following the judge's path with their eyes, wondering where he was headed, recalibrating their understanding of the evening's social map. I remained seated and kept my breathing steady, though I was acutely aware of what was about to happen. Judge Osei reached my chair. He stopped. He extended his hand. Ms. Whitfield, he said, I'm very glad you're here. The room went quiet in the way it goes quiet when something happens that nobody had predicted. My father stood frozen between the entrance and our table. I watched the expressions move across his face in sequence, confusion first, then disbelief, then something I hadn't seen there before, a kind of reckoning. I rose and took the judge's hand. It's good to see you, Your Honor. Please. He smiled slightly. We're not in chambers tonight. He glanced around the table, then pulled out the empty chair beside me. Not at the head of the room, not beside the host, beside me, and sat down. That single decision seemed to confuse my father more than the greeting had. Caitlin was looking at me with an expression that said she had just realized there was an entire story she didn't know. Theodore was watching his father with something between surprise and amusement. My mother had gone very still, her hands folded on the table, her eyes moving between me and the judge as though she were watching something finally make sense. "I imagine," Judge Osei said with a measured look around the table, "that Naomi hasn't told you much about the work she does." My father answered from across the room, his voice smaller than usual. She's always been very private about it, yes." The judge nodded. "That comes with the work." He folded his hands on the table. He had the particular quality of someone who is used to speaking to rooms, not in a performative way, but in the way of someone whose words, when they come, carry weight precisely because they don't come all the time. 11 months ago, he said, I served as an independent legal observer on a joint federal investigation that was among the most complex I have encountered in my career on the bench. No one spoke. My father had drifted closer, almost without realizing it, drawn by the gravity of whatever was unfolding. The nature of that work meant that almost no one outside the immediate team would ever know what happened, or how significant the stakes were. He paused. That's the nature of certain service. The work that matters most is often the work that disappears into silence. Theodore was watching him with careful attention. Constance had turned fully toward us. At several critical junctures in that investigation, Judge Osei continued, decisions needed to be made quickly, under conditions that were legally precarious and at moments personally dangerous. The margin for error was effectively zero. He glanced at me and for a brief second his voice shifted, not in volume but in quality, becoming something that was less professional address and more honest acknowledgement. Naomi made those decisions correctly, every time. My father's grip on his wine glass tightened. There was one evening in particular. A brief pause. A situation developed that I won't detail here. What I will say is that the judgment she exercised, not under ideal conditions but under the worst conditions, protected the integrity of the entire operation. And, as it happens, the safety of everyone involved. He looked at me directly, including me. The silence in the room was not the silence of boredom. It was the silence of people absorbing something. The retired Crown Attorney 2 seats down had gone very still. He understood, I could tell, in the way that people who have worked close to serious institutional work understand the weight of what they're hearing without needing all the details. In 30 years on the bench, Judge Osei said, I have worked alongside a great many dedicated people. Crown attorneys, police services, federal investigators, officers of the court. He paused. Very few of them have demonstrated the combination of legal precision and moral clarity under pressure that I observed in Mrs. Whitfield. My father's wine glass tilted. Not much, not enough to spill. But enough that the person standing beside him noticed and quietly stepped back. Theodore looked at Caitlin. Caitlin looked at me. Her eyes were bright. Judge Osei leaned back slightly. There's a particular kind of service that our society depends on completely and almost never acknowledges. The work done in rooms the public never sees. The decisions made by people whose names never appear in headlines. He looked around the table with a calm that somehow felt like emphasis. I have tried in my own work to recognize that kind of service when I encounter it. Because it deserves to be recognized. He turned toward my father. His tone remained entirely courteous. Nothing confrontational, nothing performative. Just the settled weight of a man who says what is true without requiring permission. Mr. Whitfield, he said, I don't know whether you're fully aware of what your daughter has built. My father's throat moved. I watched him try to assemble a response. I'm very proud of her, he managed finally. Judge Osei held his gaze for a moment. That's good, he said simply. She's earned it. Then he turned back to the table and asked Constance something about her current research, and the conversation shifted with the naturalness of someone who knows how to leave a moment without dragging it. But the room had changed. The conversations that resumed were quieter, more careful. People were processing. I could feel it, the subtle realignment of assumptions, the way perception adjusts when it has been given new information it can't ignore. My father returned to his seat at the other end of the table. He didn't perform the rest of the evening. He sat, and he ate, and he listened, and several times I caught him looking at me across the room, with an expression I didn't entirely recognize on him. It wasn't the framed acceptance letter pride. It wasn't the performative family dinner pride. It was something quieter than that, more private. The expression of someone who has been genuinely surprised and is still working out what to do with it. The dinner ended around 10. People gathered their coats and exchanged the slow, warm goodbyes of an evening that had gone better than expected. Several people stopped to speak with me. A Crown attorney from Hamilton who asked careful, interested questions. Constance, who hugged me and said she hoped we'd have a real conversation soon. Theodore, who squeezed my shoulder and said, very quietly, "My father doesn't say things like that lightly. Just so you know." Caitlin found me near the window as the room was thinning. She didn't say anything at first. She just held on to me for a long moment, the way she had that morning, and I let her. When she stepped back, she looked at me with damp eyes and something between admiration and guilt. "You never told me," she said. "There wasn't much I was allowed to say, Naomi." She shook her head. "He literally thanked you for keeping him safe. He was being generous, he was being accurate." She looked away briefly, then back. "I'm sorry. For the way things have been. The way Dad has, Caitlin, I mean it, I know you do." I took her hand. "This is your night, go enjoy it, you can feel guilty about me some other time." She laughed. A real laugh, the surprised kind. "I love you. I love you too. Go find your fiancé," she went. Judge Osei found me near the coat rack before he left. "I hope I didn't complicate your evening." "You didn't. You made it considerably more interesting." He smiled. "Your father seemed." He chose his words carefully, which was a professional habit I recognized. "Reassessing, that's one way to put it." He glanced across the now quiet room. "The people who do the invisible work," he said, almost to himself, "rarely get the moments where it becomes visible. I'm glad tonight was one of them for you." I didn't have an answer for that, I just nodded. He shook my hand, said goodnight, and left. For a few minutes, the dining room was nearly empty. Just the staff clearing glasses and two people who hadn't found their way out yet. Me and my father. He walked toward me slowly, without the posture he usually carried. Without the prepared version of himself that showed up for evenings like this. He stopped a few feet away and looked at me the way someone looks when they've been trying to organize a speech and given up on it. "I don't know where to start," he said. I didn't help him. That sounds unkind. But there are moments where being immediately reassuring would be doing someone a disservice. He needed to get there himself. "I didn't know," he said finally. "No, I mean," he exhaled. "I really didn't. I know. But he stopped. "That's the problem, isn't it? That I didn't know. That I never." He looked at his hands. "I never asked." The words were quiet, not performative. That was the thing that made them land. "You had a picture in your head of what things were supposed to look like," I said. "And I didn't fit it, so you stopped looking too hard." He didn't argue with that. Which was more honest than anything he might have said instead. "When Caitlin made partner, I threw a dinner," he said. "You did, when you..." He stopped, started again, "What you apparently did, what the judge was describing." He shook his head. "I sent a card. For something you couldn't even tell me about. You did what you knew how to do. That's not enough of an excuse." "No," I agreed. "It's not." He sat down, not in the careful, deliberate way he usually moved, but the way a person sits when something has gone out of them. "I spent so many years waiting for you to choose something I could explain to people," he said. The honesty surprised me. My father was not typically a man who said the uncomfortable thing about himself. "I know," I said. "And the whole time," he stopped. "The whole time you were doing something I couldn't have explained anyway. Because you weren't allowed to." "That's about right." He looked at me. Really looked the way he hadn't in a long time, or maybe had never quite managed. "The hardest part wasn't being compared to Caitlin," I told him. "She's wonderful. I've never begrudged her anything." "Then what was the hardest part?" I'd thought about how to say this for a long time. Not for tonight, just in general. The way you sometimes rehearse truths you think you might never say. The hardest part was feeling like you weren't curious about me. Like you had already decided what I was, and checking in any further just wasn't worth the effort. His face changed, not dramatically. But something moved in it that I don't have a precise word for. Regret maybe, except more specific than regret. The specific grief of understanding that time was spent in a way you cannot now recover. "I was curious," he said. Then more quietly, "I just didn't show it. That's not really different from not being curious, Dad." He nodded slowly. "No," he said, "I don't suppose it is." Outside, a light rain had begun. It tapped against the restaurant windows in the way that rain in Toronto does in October. Not aggressive, just persistent. "I'm not asking you to apologize," I said. "I want to." He did. Briefly, without drama. He said he was sorry. He said he had been wrong. He said it in the plain, unadorned way that people say things when they mean them and don't have the energy left for decoration. I believed him. That surprised me a little. I reached across and put my hand over his. He went still for a moment. Then he put his other hand over mine, and we sat like that for a while, listening to the staff clear the last of the tables, and the rain, and the particular silence that happens after something has shifted. We didn't fix everything that night. Some things don't fix in a single evening, and the ones that do probably weren't really broken to begin with. What happened was something more modest and, I think, more lasting. A door opened. Just a door. What we did with it was still to be decided. 4 months later, my mother called to tell me my unit had been quietly recognized in a government memo that had briefly, very briefly, become public before being reclassified. It wasn't a ceremony. It wasn't an award. Just a sentence in a document that most people would never read, acknowledging that a team of federal officers had conducted a complex, multi-year investigation with distinction. My father saw it. He called me the same day, not to summarize the memo, not to describe it to me as though I didn't know what it said. He called to say one thing. I read it. I wanted to call. Okay, you don't have to say anything. A pause. I just wanted you to know I read it. We talked for 40 minutes after that. Not about the memo, not about Caitlin, not about anything particular. Just talked. The way people talk when they've decided to start paying attention. I've thought about that conversation often since then. How little it took in the end to begin again. A phone call. The willingness to say I read it, which was really just a way of saying I'm paying attention now. I used to think the most important thing was being seen by the people whose opinion you've spent years trying to earn, and maybe it still is, a little. But I've learned something from the kind of work I do, in the rooms no one sees, making decisions no one acknowledges. You cannot do the work for the recognition. You do it because it's right, because it matters, because the people on the other side of those decisions are real, and their safety is real, and no amount of approval or disappointment from anyone, even someone who loves you, changes that. The recognition when it comes is not the point. But I won't pretend it isn't something either.